Professor Fukuyama, we have so many questions. How secure is the liberal democratic order? Can society decay, go backwards? How is the in-between when we look at the US election? Those questions and more will be discussed with the infamous political philosopher Francis Fukuyama tonight as we wait towards the 2024 US presidential elections. A warm welcome to you, Professor Fukuyama. We are thrilled to have you. And
Thank you very much.
And to our moderator, Tobias Endler, welcome. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
My name is Katharina Luther, and I am the director of the German-American Institute here in Tübingen. And I also welcome our audience in front of their screens and in our hall at the Institute, just behind me. Thank you for spending the evening with us. The conversation we are about to have here is part of the German-American Institute's Democratic Crossroads series and takes place in cooperation with the Landeszentrale für politische Bildung Baden-Württemberg, Radio Micro Europe, M100 Sanssouci Kolloquium, Tübingen Campus Magazin Kupferblau, Freies Radio Wüste Welle, and the University of Tübingen. Thank you so much to our partners. We couldn't do this without you. And with that, I hand everything over to the two of you. Enjoy and thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Katharina Luther, and to the entire German-American Institute team in Tübingen. Welcome everybody to the third round of our Democratic Crossroads Talk series. Welcome to all of you online around the globe and across Germany, and to all of you on the ground at the d.a.i in Tübingen. It is my honor to welcome today's guest, Professor Francis Fukuyama of Stanford University, where he is the Olivier Nomellini Senior Fellow at the Freeman-Spogli Institute for International Studies, and also director of the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy. Francis Fukuyama has written widely on issues in international politics, and at least to the same extent on the state of liberal democracy, but also the potential future of liberal democracy. All of this we will touch on tonight, our time, and in the morning, Frank, your time on the California coast. So once again, welcome. Thanks for freeing up time for this. Good morning to California. Great to have you.
Thank you very much, Tobias. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Just quickly, because this is important and this is some ground that we'll base our conversation on. Francis Fukuyama's most recent book is called Liberalism and its Discontents. It was published in May 2022. The German title is Liberalismus und seine Feinde, so liberalism and its enemies. And that itself is interesting, why the German title would be enemies instead of discontents. We'll maybe get to talk about this too. But then really Francis Fukuyama is the kind of guest that has not been in need of a real introduction ever since the early 1990s, when he became famous for his book, The End of History and the Last Man. So let's dive right in, Frank. We live in turbulent times. Many people are concerned about the state of the world, concerned about the state of democracy. And as we try to make sense of what's going on, there are a lot of big words out there that the people use a lot: democracy, populism, authoritarianism, and of course, liberalism. You also use that term, liberalism, a lot. So, Frank, what do you mean when you talk about liberalism?
Thank you, Tobias. Yes, that's an important starting point. The word liberalism has different meanings in different parts of the world. In the United States, it usually means you're left of center. In Germany, it connotes a center-right position, similar to that of the Free Democrats, that's pro-business, anti-regulation, and so forth. My definition is broader than either of those. It doesn't so much have to do with economic policy, so much as a presumption that all human beings have an equal entitlement to recognition of their dignity. States provide that recognition by granting them rights, basic rights to speech, to organization, to political participation, and a liberal does not believe that one group of human beings is superior to another. So in that sense, It's different from nationalism that would single out maybe one ethnic group or, one particular people. And the institutions that support liberalism are things like the rule of law that limit the power of the government to do things that are not lawful, constitutions, constitutional checks and balances that limit the power of the state. Liberalism by itself is usually paired with democracy, but these are different institutions. Democracy really has to do with mechanisms of accountability, like elections. They oftentimes are united in common with each other, but they can also be separate. And one of the things that's happened in Europe and in the United States is that the democratic part of liberal democracy has been attacking the liberal part. So this was most clear with Viktor Orban in Hungary. He actually said that he wanted Hungary to be an illiberal democracy, meaning that Hungary would have elections, would have popular mandates, but he would use that mandate to restrict certain kinds of liberties because he wants Hungary to have a Hungarian national identity. Christianity becomes, the dominant religion and so forth. And so that's the issue right now, is whether you can preserve the liberal part of liberal democracy.
Thank you. And you already touched on some of the, attacks that we see coming from both the right and the left. You mentioned Hungary, attacks on liberalism as you see it. And we'll talk about this in some more detail a little bit down the road as we talk about the United States in 2024, obviously, and the election cycle that's long been underway and that's sort of taking up speed. Let's stick with liberalism for a second here. You also mentioned democracy, obviously, and basically took the next question out of my mouth. The way I understand you, liberalism and democracy often go together, but they don't necessarily have to. Is that correct? Could you imagine
Yes.
like a modern Western society based on liberalism, but with serious impediments to democracy, or the other way around?
Well, liberalism without democracy and democracy without liberalism have both existed. So if you think about the classic German Rechtsstaat, that was a liberal state. You had property rights, you had individual rights that were protected by a rule of law, but you didn't have open elections in which all, adults could vote. And that was very common in the 19th century in many parts of Europe. And you also today have many examples of illiberal democracies. So again, we'll take Hungary as an example where the rule of law has been weakened. There's a lot of manipulation of courts and judges to suit the interest of Fidesz, the ruling party. But there has been a democratic election. There may have been some complaints about fairness, but basically, I think most people would concede that Fidesz was supported by a majority of Hungarians, and so that's an example of an illiberal democracy.
And we'll have to get back to this a little bit later and ask you about the United States, obviously, in that context, and the buzzword of illiberal democracy. We'll get to this in a second. Just because you touched on the German meaning, or the meaning in Germany of liberalism, which you defined, I think, very, very quickly and correctly. So just as an aside, maybe, how come that liberalism has such a different meaning in the United States from what it used to mean and still means to most people in Germany? What do you make of that? It's a rather funny change in meaning.
Yeah, I think that I'm not sure of the actual historical designation liberalism in the United States, but I do think that liberalism is actually a foundational doctrine in the U.S. and in to a similar degree in Britain, because these countries were founded on what we would call Lockean principles. John Locke, the great philosopher, was the apologist for the revolution, the English Revolution that occurred in the 16th century and then was consolidated in the Glorious Revolution a few decades later, where the supremacy of law and the supremacy of parliament over the monarchy were established. And of course, the American Revolution was based on a revolt against the power of the British monarchy and the assertion by the American colonists that they had the right to govern themselves. John Locke said that legitimate government is based on consent of the governed, and that's been a foundational principle in the United States. I think in Europe, liberalism has been associated with, a certain economic doctrine. Ordo liberalismus, has been a powerful force in Germany, and I think it acquired this, as I said, right of center significance that liberalism really represented a certain attitude towards the market and the protection of market and property rights. And we have a different term in the United States, libertarianism, that in a way is closer to liberalism as it's understood in Germany, where libertarians really don't like the government. They want the government to stop regulating. They want to give people the freedom in social circles to, if they want to smoke, they can smoke, they can take drugs, they can do all sorts of things without government interference. And that's a different form of the meaning of the word liberalism, but it's not the one I endorse, because I actually think that governments are pretty important and their authority is necessary in order to maintain a liberal order, because if you don't have a state that can enforce laws, you don't really have a liberal society.
Yeah, and governments, I think most of us would agree, governments are important. They have responsibility for the people that elected them into office. And as you went through that tour de force, in the history of the term liberalism, how it's been evolving up until this day, I started thinking there are some big promises that come along with liberalism, and you go about these promises in your book as well. And you don't shy away from talking about the shortcomings of liberalism as well. So let's maybe move in that direction and see. You mentioned the dignity of the human individual. That's crucial. You mentioned the rule of law that liberalism is based on, and promises, basically. As we look at the shortcomings of liberalism, especially in the context of today, the recent past and present, Frank, aren't the critics, the critics of liberalism and liberal democracy right when they mention some of these shortcomings, and when they state that maybe liberalism is not all that it claims to be? So maybe you could take us through the shortcomings, the main shortcomings
Sure.
that you detect.
Well, I think that the critique differs whether you're on the left or on the right. So the critique from the left is pretty straightforward. It's that liberalism promises to treat people equally under law, but in fact, they don't ever live up to that. And people continue to be discriminated against whatever the law says. So the law doesn't achieve its promise. In the United States, this became very evident to people in 2020 after the murder by a policeman of George Floyd, this black man who was choked to death basically by a policeman in Minneapolis. And that underlined to people that, the police do not treat Black Americans the same as white Americans, despite the commitment, in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. And so I think on the part of many people in the progressive left, they think that liberalism doesn't fulfill its promises. It's weak. It doesn't really, because of the prohibitions on too much intervention in society by the state, it doesn't create enough of an equal playing field for people across racial, ethnic, gender, and other kinds of lines. And so that's a pretty straightforward critique. And I think any liberal would have to admit that that's true, that there is a big gap between the promise and the performance.
Just quickly, if I may, because you mentioned the Declaration of Independence already, and it says there's also the pursuit of happiness in there, right? How does that square with the idea of equality/inequality? Because a lot of people tend to read it like, I'm not only allowed to pursue happiness, it's not only equal opportunities, it's equal outcomes.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the part of the demand on the left. We have this acronym DEI that's very common in universities and corporations: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the equity part is deliberately defined differently from equality as traditionally understood, because traditionally equality meant equality of opportunity or equality of treatment, but equity means equality of outcomes. And this is one of the critiques of liberalism that was made from the left, that you didn't really have anything like equity, that if you looked at average incomes, life expectancy, incarceration rates, all of these things, that between blacks and whites, the gap remains still very, very large, despite the promises, made at the time of the civil rights movement. I guess my answer to that is that all of these critiques are true. So all men are created equal. Thomas Jefferson writes that in the Declaration of Independence. But when the American Republic was founded in 1789, the only people who had a right to vote were white men who owned property. And I think a lot of the subsequent history of the United States has been the progressive expansion of who is considered a full human being with full rights. And so the property qualification was dropped off in the early 19th century. The American Civil War was really fought over the question of whether African Americans could be citizens, and that was theoretically settled in the 14th Amendment in the 1860s after the Civil War, but it took another century for African Americans to actually achieve equal voting rights, So this was kind of a shameful aspect of American history. Women didn't get the right to vote until the early 20th century. And so, there's been this steady expansion of rights. In my view, it's important that we had this promise of equality, because that's what gave momentum to social progress and the inclusion of more and more groups um, in who's considered a full rights-bearing human being. But it's still not a completed journey, and we still have inequalities in treatment and certainly big inequalities in outcomes. And I think that's where many people, especially young people today on the left, get very impatient with our liberal society.
And I'm grateful for you mentioning the left and that sort of left criticism of a liberal promise, if you want, one of the shortcomings. And we already have a question coming in that I was going to save for later, but I'll take it now because it fits exactly fits in with what you just said, Frank. About, like, you call it a tax on the left and on the right towards liberalism. It could also be called criticism of, liberal promises, I guess. Do you think that, at least the idea of classical liberalism, that's the question that's being asked here, is being threatened by the left through what is usually called woke identity politics? Or is it the other way around? Do you feel that they have a right to say so because what they stand for is being threatened by a false promise of liberalism?
Well, they certainly have a right to make that case. I think that, however, the agenda of identity politics at some point becomes very anti-liberal. So there's really two meanings of identity politics. Maybe we should back up a little bit and just give a little bit of the history of this.
Sure.
In the 20th century, what it meant to be a person of the left, people on the left want greater equality, but inequality was understood, in largely Marxist terms. It was the big class division between bourgeoisie and proletariat, between managers and workers, and so forth. In the last few decades, the understanding of inequality has shifted to narrower groups that are defined by race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. And, the argument, which is a true one, is that the marginalization and oppression of these groups differs by what you are. A black man is going to be treated differently from a white woman that somehow, isn't allowed to achieve her potential, because of patriarchal assumptions, and this sort of thing. Now, if the focus on identity, these narrower categories of inequality, are understood as efforts to mobilize people that are treated as a member of a group involuntarily by the larger society, and what they want is inclusion in the broader liberal order that promises everybody equal treatment, then that, I think, is a legitimate form of democratic politics, that people should be able to organize, they should be able to form groups and then lobby and use the political system to achieve greater equality. But there's a different form of identity politics that says that your race, gender, sexual orientation is an essential characteristic about you. That's the most important thing that someone can know, and the state has to treat you differently based on which one of these groups you're in. And that leads to, let's say affirmative action programs where you're hired simply on the basis of your gender or your skin color, without regard to your qualities as an individual. And that's the point, I think, where woke politics or identity politics becomes illiberal, because the fundamental premise in liberal politics is that everybody is an individual and should be recognized, as a equal individual with rights, but also judged as an individual, and not simply because you happen to be born in a group that you had no control over. And I think that's what becomes very controversial uh, in many societies, where people feel that, these formerly marginalized groups are being given privileges and are being treated better than, the majority population in the country. That's a lot of the opposition to immigration, that we're too solicitous of immigrants and we don't treat our own people with equal respect or with equal benefits, and that sort of thing.
That's at least what the perception of some people
Yes, the
tends to
perception.
be, right? And it's certainly debatable. But and we'll get back to this during the second half of our talk. Also, how the political right maybe attempts to play patterns like this. But it was interesting for me that you seem to touch on the second of the three big shortcomings of liberalism that you mentioned in your book as you were speaking: hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, maybe you could explain what you mean by that shortcoming of liberalism, and also because you mentioned, you seem to allude to campus protests and certain groups in society that claim their rights at times in very sort of straightforward ways. Also, I would be interested whether you see that that hypocrisy shortcoming of liberalism, or that people claim it in relation to what's going on currently on US campuses, for example. Do you think that people actually protest one of the shortcomings or more of the shortcomings of liberalism as these campus protests go on, or is this too far-fetched for you?
No, I mean, hypocrisy plays in both the left and the right critiques of what's happening in campuses today. So, um, a lot of the pro-Palestinian protesters in many universities are complaining that their universities are not actually open to all positions, and that they've been too pro-Israel in terms of their endowments and the companies they own stock in, and in terms of the public positions they've taken. But there's also a conservative critique that the universities themselves have been uh, claiming that they were bastions of free speech, but in fact, you can't say certain more conservative things about race, gender, sexual orientation. That's what cancel culture is about. And if you're a professor that, takes a position, even one based on a lot of evidence and, research that violates some of these new norms about the way we speak about these identity topics, then it's not just that you're criticized, but you're shouted down, and you face demands to be the university has to fire you or not give you a platform where you can pursue these ideas. I think that, right now, university administrators have to make this distinction. I think it's a legitimate one, but they have to enforce a distinction between permitting freedom of speech, where you get to follow the liberal principle that, there's a marketplace of ideas and everybody should express their views, but that doesn't cross over into actual harassment, threats, certainly not into violence. And walking that line turns out to be quite difficult, because a lot of campus protesters, have demanded that the university not permit certain people to speak. They don't seem to be that interested in actually having a calm discussion about the rights and wrongs of the current conflict in Gaza, this sort of thing. So I think there's charges of hypocrisy from both sides at the present moment.
Is this something, just out of curiosity, because you're at Stanford currently, is this something you encounter at Stanford as well? And how does the university deal with this? Because I was at Columbia only last week, where it all started, and then later on at the University of Texas in Austin, and again, partly violent protests, the police going in. So a lot of problems, a lot of challenges. Is this something you encounter at Stanford at the moment, or not so much?
Yeah, we've had an encampment at Stanford, so these are pro-Palestinian students that are living in tents, in some public space. And we had one that went on until I think March, and then they finally closed that down. But then after the Columbia protests, when the police moved in, many other schools in solidarity, they reestablished their encampment. I think that it's been a kind of complicated tactical issue for university presidents. So the Columbia president decided that the encampment was really disruptive. A lot of times they're banging drums all night and, not letting students into certain buildings and this sort of thing. And so they called in the police, and that, had the predictable effect of escalating the outrage against the administration. And I think that was probably a mistake. In Stanford, they've allowed the encampment to remain, but it's very much contained. And, they don't bang drums and they don't disrupt, that much activity. And so therefore, I think we've had a slightly calmer spring than many schools have.
I mean, the way you phrase it, I mean, I just have to sort of ask you about the main justifications for liberalism that you also list in your book, because the way you describe it, one would think that, the United States as a country, as a nation, has reached a certain limit, where the promise of liberalism maybe doesn't work that well anymore. If you have to send in the police as a head of a big school or a university rector against your own students, that certainly looks weird from the outside. But some of the main justifications for liberalism that you list in your book, my question would be, do these justifications still hold true in the 21st century and in 2024, especially as we move closer to this year and events on the ground? Maybe you could walk us through the main justifications that you feel liberalism still holds, and explain why you chose these.
I think in a polarized and very divisive period like the one we're in, the need for liberalism is all the more important. Liberalism began as a doctrine in the middle 17th century. So after the Protestant Reformation, Europe was consumed in 150 years of religious warfare. And the argument of early liberals was that we need peace, we need security of individuals, despite the fact that they differ with regard to their religious confession. And so the idea was to take this commitment to final ends as defined by a particular religious doctrine out of public life. You can believe whatever you want as a private individual, but the state would be neutral with regard to whether you're Protestant or Catholic or, whatever. And tolerance would be the chief virtue that you needed to survive in a liberal society. And I think that's still the case, that we are in many ways more diverse today than in the 17th century, in 17th century Europe. It's not just religion, it's ethnicity, it's race, it's, with equal rights for women, gender becomes an important, dividing line. And I think that liberal rules are the only ones that can permit everybody to live peacefully with one another. India is a good example of where that's being challenged right now, because India was founded by Nehru and Gandhi on liberal principles. And I don't see how else you can govern a country like that that's diverse in terms of religion, caste, region, language. So a liberal India basically allows people to tolerate everybody else. What Prime Minister Modi and his Hindu nationalist party have been trying to do is to shift that national identity to one that's based on Hinduism. And that means that you're disenfranchising, the 200 million Muslims that live in India. And that is just a formula for, long-term communal violence, of which we've already seen, an unfortunate amount. So, liberalism in the first instance is simply a pragmatic way of getting people in diverse societies to live peacefully by imposing, laws that require them to be tolerant and to treat each other, tolerantly. But when you challenge the principles of liberalism itself, then, liberal states have a problem, because you need that framework in order to have a kind of peaceful coexistence of these diverse groups.
Let me challenge you a little bit, if I may. The way you describe it, it sounds beautiful as an abstract principle. But as you brought up India as an example, I'd like to bring up the United States, a country that we all hold dear, but that's certainly living through big challenges, to put it mildly. So the idea of liberalism, to everybody is given a chance or a way to tolerate everybody else. I think tolerate everybody else is the way you phrased it. That seems like a very, like a principle very removed from a lot of people's lives. I mean, a former president who's running for office again now basically violated that principle all along the way, and it led all the way to the assault on Congress on January 6th back then. But how do you justify one of the main justifications for liberalism, a moral justification about human dignity, about tolerance, given the fact that someone like him makes it, into the highest office in the country, violating a lot of people's dignity along the way, and up until this day, women, minorities, disabled people, and so forth. How does that even work together?
Well, I mean, the threat of a populist like Donald Trump is a threat to the liberal principle itself, and liberalism doesn't have a solution to that. I mean, it's meant to solve that problem, but it doesn't mean that everybody will necessarily understand those principles and abide by them. And I think that Trump is simply one of a whole series of illiberal leaders that have been popularly elected in Turkey and Hungary and Poland, in Slovakia and many other places around the world. And I think that liberals, in a way, have forgotten their own origins, and many people have taken liberal principles for granted. That liberalism has produced a lot of peace and prosperity, but only because people are willing to play by liberal rules and, be tolerant and so forth. But now you're getting overt threats to, liberalism. So internationally, now you've got two great powers, Russia and China, that are distinctly anti-liberal, and they're actually, in the case of Russia, using violence to overturn, a neighboring liberal society. And at that point, liberals just need to fight back. I mean, literally, in the case of Ukraine, we've been providing weapons so that the Ukrainians can defend their own liberal order. In the United States, in Poland, in other places that have populist illiberal movements, we have to use different means. We have to use the ballot box in elections as a way of defending that liberal order. And what I find, unfortunately, very disturbing is that many people living in liberal societies don't understand that their own system is under threat. In the United States, to someone like me, a political scientist, it seems pretty clear that this is not a normal election, that this is really an election to preserve the fundamental institutions of a liberal society. You have one candidate that lost the last election, didn't accept that loss, and then summon a mob to basically use violence in order to stay in office. This is something that happens in young democracies, but it shouldn't be happening in the United States. But despite that, you get all these Republicans now and Republican voters and Republican officials that try to minimize what happened on January 6th, that say, oh, it was just a peaceful demonstration that got a little bit out of hand. And they don't blame Donald Trump for what was obviously a very deliberate effort to overturn an election.
Yeah.
And so the fact that you're living in a liberal society doesn't mean that everybody accepts those liberal principles. And, you know, what's remarkable about Trump is that this is the first time we've had a candidate in anyone's living memory that didn't accept this basic principle. You know, for example, the orderly transition of power. If you lose an election, you concede that you've lost and you step down. And that is a huge violation of the rule of law that, you know, and that's really what we have to defend here.
Most certainly. And like you said, this is something you would expect in young democracies. Maybe it's to do with the fact that the United States is such an old democracy and some of its institutions are outdated. And you also touch on this in your book, obviously, and you know, with regard to the Electoral College and other institutions that might be in need of reform. But since you mentioned populism, Frank, a couple of times now, I would like to sort of ask you, could you define populism for us? Because it's another one of these big words out there, you know, somewhat cloudy, that are hard to grasp. And also, would you say that Trump is a quintessential populist, if there is such a thing?
Sure. Well, there are several possible definitions of populism. I think the one that is the most relevant right now is that populists believe that, you know, in a sense, the visible reality is fake because it is being manipulated by elites that are acting behind the scenes to, you know, to order things to their interest and not to the interests of ordinary people. And that's why many populists buy into conspiracy theories of various sorts that, you know, the election was really stolen, that the vaccines were all part of a plot on the part of, you know, elites controlling the public health authorities that wanted to make people vaccinated or wear masks simply as a matter of power, you know, this sort of thing. You know, that's one sense of it. The other is that, you know, populists believe in things that are popular but not necessarily good in the long run. So, you know, you run a inflationary monetary policy before the election so that, you know, things will look really good, but everything's going to come crashing down, you know, in the long run. And in fact, that's one of the issues in the coming election in the United States, because Trump and people around him have been talking about removing the independence of the Federal Reserve, which would be a disaster. You know, it meant that next time around, if you have a Trump-appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, the money supply is going to expand, interest rates are going to fall before the next election, and you're just setting up the ground for, you know, a disaster down the road. And so those are a couple of different meanings, but I really think that, you know, this opposition to elites, existing elites, is probably the key issue. And it means that you can't believe anything that's said in the legacy media. You can't believe the government. You can't believe public health authorities, because all of these are suspect now.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning this. And also, I think there's a lot more to worry about as we look at the Project 2025 that's out there, right? And we can all read up online. It's some 900 pages, I think, of ideas and concepts. I haven't made it through them. I'm not sure why you want to. Yeah. I agree. And we'll get back to this in a second, also in the Q&A section, when we give our audience a chance to ask more questions. Just to wrap up the idea of populism, is populism always anti-democratic?
Well, no, I think that in many cases, you do have a problem with elites that get out of touch with, feelings of ordinary people. And some forms of populism are actually quite important. So, for example, during the Great Depression in the 1930s, the elites really screwed up. They brought about this economic catastrophe. Unemployment in the United States reached 25%, so 1/4 of the population didn't have a job. And there was a popular mobilization, but that mobilization was used by Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic Party to put in place the foundations of the American welfare state. So they created Social Security. They created, a state that could actually promote jobs and economic growth. They regulated the stock market, so that popular energy was directed towards actually constructing institutions that were very important in subsequent generations. But the current kind of populism that we face is, really disconnected from any concrete benefits to people. So Trump, kept railing against China and imports and so forth, but they actually increased under his presidency. And, he wasn't able to actually achieve any of the kinds of objectives he set for himself. The other thing that, we should probably mention about the current nature of populism is that I think it really depends heavily on the internet and the kind of technological world that we are living in. It used to be that, let's say 30 years ago, if you claimed that vaccines were harmful and that it was really a conspiracy of elites to make people take vaccines, first of all, you wouldn't have heard that argument made in the mainstream media. And you had many fewer media channels, by which people could get information. But today, anybody can say anything they want. And so if you go on to Google and you say, "Are vaccines safe?" you'll get 10,000, websites that will say, "Oh, no, they're actually very dangerous and they're a conspiracy," and so forth. And all of that is false. But that's what the internet has done, where there's really no quality control over the kind of information that people get. And that, I think, feeds populism because, as I said, populism is really the belief that the apparent reality that you're looking at is not the real one. It's something else, and that you're being manipulated behind the scenes. And, the internet makes it much easier to believe a story like that.
Thanks very much, Frank. Let me pick up a question that just came up as you were speaking regarding populism, where someone says, you said populists talk about elites, and this person says as if they don't exist. My impression was rather like elites are being seen as those who are sort of pulling the strings behind the scenes. But the question is, isn't crony capitalism actually a great threat to democracy? So don't populists, some of the populist views that are being held might have a point or a certain element of truth to them.
There's certainly a point, but I think that the solution to that is kind of traditional social democracy, basically, where a state that has the legitimacy of, having been elected actually regulates capitalism and creates rules. That's what you want a liberal order for. But actual populists out there have actually promoted crony capitalism. So Viktor Orban, I keep picking on him, but he's the chief example out there. Hungary today is nothing but crony capitalism. Orban and his family have enriched themselves as a result of their favoring, of a circle of Fidesz supporters that are rewarded with, public contracts and so forth. So if you want to do something about crony capitalism, that kind of populist agenda is not what you want. Same thing with Donald Trump. I mean, the remarkable thing is every other president, first of all, we didn't have that many businessmen becoming president, but we had a lot of rich people becoming president, and they would all divest. Yeah, they divest themselves of a lot of their assets, or put them in a blind trust. Trump didn't do that. He kept operating his businesses, and in fact, he used his government office to promote his businesses. And so everybody wanted to stay at the Trump Hotel in Washington and do events at Trump golf courses and so forth. There was really shameless exploitation of your public office for private purposes. And that's part of the reason he's in the court all the time, because he actually wasn't, violating a lot of rules against that kind of double dealing. And so I think that the charge of crony capitalism is a correct one. It does exist in many modern liberal democracies, but populism is really not the answer to that. You need actually an impersonal state that can enforce rules against that sort of thing and enforce them.
And just to stick with the idea of elites, because this person brought it up, and we have another question sort of going in that direction. In Germany, there's a phenomenon, right-wing parties, and also on the left, and we have that peculiar combination, the so-called Querfront phenomenon, where left and right-wing people sort of agree and tend to work together on certain critiques of the elites. So I'll be interested in the United States. What's your view of that development? Do you feel that the elites, sort of, you talked about politicians that hold office, obviously they would belong to the elites in that way of reading reality, if you want. But does this comprise also people like you who hold positions at the university, so academic experts, for example, journalists, media producers, intellectuals? Do you feel that like all of these actors in society are sort of being thrown into the same pot? Or do people differentiate and have a problem mostly with politics?
That's definitely happening. And it's a big problem in the following sense. Many of the critiques that are being made by conservatives today are actually, I think, legitimate. They reflect legitimate problems. So, for example, people coming across the southern border, for the last several years, they've been taking advantage of the asylum laws. They're basically economic migrants, but they're claiming asylum status, and the United States then has to take them in. That is a big problem. And I don't think Joe Biden has dealt with it adequately to get that border under control. But the problem is that given how polarized the politics is, if you, as a person on the left, say, well, we really ought to do something about the border, immediately all of your colleagues on the left are going to say, you're defending Trump, or you're adopting Trump's policies, and people don't want to deal with that, and so they just don't say anything, and they don't make reasonable criticisms from the right because they're going to be accused of being extreme right and representing these populist views. So that's one of the reasons why we've kind of retreated into these more extreme positions on the far right and the far left, because taking a position in the middle that's saying, yeah, there is something to the conservative critique becomes much, much more difficult.
So let's, based on this, Frank, thanks so much so far. This is great. Let's move into 2024 and the ongoing election campaign. You've mentioned a number of shortcomings, I think, in terms of institutions, in terms of maybe a lack of trust regarding those who really hold power or are running for power. One question that just came in, and maybe that's as good a starting point as any, is referring to the younger generations, which are getting more important. Obviously, the Democrats have realized this somewhat sooner, one could argue, than the Republicans. But just to sort of rephrase that question, if you look at the current state of political affairs in the United States and the upcoming elections, how do you look at the younger generation? Also, as someone who teaches at a renowned university, deals with young people on a daily basis, and some of these people are disenchanted. How do you encourage them to sort of become re-engaged and active in the upcoming elections, and not sort of repeat what happened in 2016, when a lot of young people afterwards said, we didn't even go cast our vote because Hillary was going to win anyway, which proved a tragic era. So what is your message for these younger people? How do you, as a professor, possibly also get that message across?
Well, it's hard. There's
Mhm.
several things contributing to that. I mean, one is Joe Biden himself. He's already in his 80s, and I think that a lot of younger people just feel that he can't relate to them, and they can't relate to somebody that's that of that generation.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, Maybe it would have been better if a year and a half ago he had just announced he was going to step down, and then there had been a contest for a candidate that was 20 years younger than him. But unfortunately, that's not happening. I think that, and then the thing that's happened since October 7th is that a lot of young people are actually much more left-wing and progressive than their parents and certainly their grandparents. That's
Mhm.
become evidence with all these protests in many campuses, but they've also bought into this form of identity politics. And it's interesting, the only thing they've gotten angry about is when a non-white person is the victim of, what they call settler colonial violence. And it's potentially going to hurt Biden a lot, especially in a state like Michigan, which is a swing state. It would normally vote Democratic, but because there's a lot of Arab Americans and a lot of young
Mhm.
people that are really disillusioned with Biden's Middle East policies, they may, I don't think that most of them would vote for Trump, but they just may not vote at all. And that could make a really big difference in the outcome of an election. Um,
Mhm.
I think that with regard to um, your question of how to appeal to them,
Yeah.
it's complicated because, what appeals to me is the threat to basic institutions. But I think that that's a hard argument to make because a lot of young people, in a way, take those institutions for granted, like their
Mhm.
freedom of speech or their ability to
Mhm.
demonstrate could be threatened in a Trump administration. He really wanted to use the Insurrection Act to tamp down on the protest that occurred in the 2020 after George Floyd was killed. And if he were president during these campus uh, encampments and protests, he may have called out the National Guard or even the Army, and just he wanted to show that he was in charge and their freedoms would be directly impacted. But instead, they turn their anger against Joe Biden, who's not doing that, simply because I think they don't understand the stakes and they don't understand the potential for the country moving in a very illiberal right-wing nationalist direction. So I think that you still got to teach people about that and say, do you really want that kind of intolerance? Because the threat, is, I mean, some of these students are calling Joe Biden Genocide Joe, as if
Mhm.
he's responsible for genocide. And, I think it's completely crazy given, his actual positions. But um, you somehow need to teach them that the real threat of authoritarian government is not coming from that camp. It's really coming from the right at this point.
Yeah, and I agree. You and I agree, and I think most people out there, one would think. But to maybe turn this around and also pick up another question, we have a lot of questions coming in, so this is just great. Do you think that Joe Biden, though, is the right guy who will sort of get the job done that you just described? Or another way that I think it's beautiful the way this is being phrased is, what's the role of emotion in the state of current social and political tension in the United States, and also with regard to the elections? And this sort of reminds me of some of the shortcomings and promises of liberalism that we talked about before, also the ideal of rational discourse, and relying on rational arguments. Frank, do you believe that someone like Joe Biden can pull this off, and is appealing to people's rational the way to win people over, especially the young people? Or should there be more emotion in whichever way in there, which is also risky, right?
Uh, yeah, that's a complicated question to answer. So it's,
Yeah.
Biden so far has been touting his accomplishments. We
Mhm.
have pretty full employment. The economy is growing, much more rapidly than almost any other rich country. There's a lot of technological innovation, but that is not really getting through to people, despite the fact that economic conditions are very good. A lot of Americans seem to think that they're very bad, and it's just wrong, but it's hard to convince them otherwise. I think that there are a couple of issues where he could show strength as a leader that would appeal more emotionally. So one of them, again, is that southern border issue. He can say immigration is a good thing. America is a nation of immigrants. That's an important tradition, but we can't let this happen without, control. We need to manage that border and make sure that the people that come in are, deserve to come in. That's something he could do. The other issue has to do with the question of patriotism, because typically Democrats and the left don't like to emphasize patriotism, whereas Donald Trump literally wraps himself in an American flag, at every opportunity. And I think the Republicans should not be allowed to steal the issue of patriotism in that fashion. And so, I think Biden could be much more vocal in, talking about, why the United States is great, why he loves the country, why other people ought to love the country, and not criticize those who, are patriotic. I mean, that's a mistake I think a lot of liberal leaders make, because liberals tend to believe in, kind of universal human rights, and therefore our country isn't anything that special. But I think that when you're getting into the realm of emotion, as you said, that's something that's important to do. Is Biden capable of that? Well, I guess one final thing.
Yeah.
A lot of the support for Trump is not that people, he has a group of supporters that love them, but many swing voters don't love him, but they really don't like a lot of things that are going on the left. Transgender rights advocacy, LGBTQ issues. And I think that it should be possible for Biden, who's always been a kind of centrist, to say, yes, we support these rights, but, we don't believe the government should be out front, promoting, transgender, bathrooms and, and this sort of thing. He could make a break with some of the more outlandish things that come out of that progressive form of identity politics. Bill Clinton did that, very well when he was running for president. There's this black activist, Sister Souljah, and Clinton just attacked her, and said, this is not America, and this is, not what we're about. And Biden could do that, but he hasn't. And I think, that would help a lot. And that's something that it's a symbolic act, but it does appeal to emotions, and it signals what side of this cultural divide you're on.
So what I'm hearing is a good leader, in quotation marks in these times, will be someone who does not harp on economic success all the time, which is a real fact. I mean, in Germany, we wish we had that sort of growth, we had that sort of energy independence, we could afford to export energy if we wanted to, and so on, like you guys can. So, but you would still say that a good leader shouldn't sort of harp on these successes all the time, but should actually address these so-called culture issues / identity politics in a different way, or not let.
Yeah, no, that's basically it. Yeah, I mean, you can't accept either the extreme hostility to identity politics on the right. You're not going to embrace white nationalism, but you can also say that there's something wrong and very illiberal and un-American about some of the manifestations of identity politics on the left, cancel culture and all of that sort of thing.
But then what I guess the question behind that question is, and that's something you touched on and I thought was fascinating. So the economy is doing well overall on average, but somehow you said people don't feel it, people don't sort of, it's not on their minds so much, just something else bothering them. So what is the issue that is going to decide the election in November, if not the economy?
Well, some of the most important considerations for voters are ones that neither candidate can do anything about. Biden's age and his apparent, the fact that he shows his age much more than Trump does, that you can't do anything about. If there's a policy issue that, could really help, it's some combination of closing the southern border and being much more assertive about supporting, public safety, walking back all of these demands to defund the police that came out after George Floyd in 2020. Just saying, I'm in favor of, public authority, public security, including security of borders. We like immigration, but we need to, control it and make sure that we're getting, the people we want rather than, whoever decides to, take advantage of a loophole in our laws. I think those are probably the single most important things under the control of actual policy that Biden could be doing.
If this is among the most important things, then I mean, what follows from this is Biden's VP candidate questions, and what naturally, I mean, Kamala Harris is going to be on the ticket again. She was in charge, or assigned by Biden to take care of the border challenge. What do you make of that? I mean, has she?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Kamala Harris is probably less popular than Biden, and he again is sort of stuck with her. I think if he wanted to change his vice president, he would have had to do it already some months ago. So that's not going to happen. However, the one thing she's been doing lately is insisting on attacking the Republicans over abortion. And that is one of the big issues that, for example, that was important in the Polish election. The liberal parties didn't like this very restrictive abortion law that the Law and Justice Party had pushed. And similar thing is happening in the United States. This overturning of Roe v. Wade and the ability of Republican states to restrict abortion is very, very unpopular. And it's unpopular with those middle-class women in swing states that are critical, to the upcoming election. And it's going to drive a lot of turnout. And so she's, the vice president has actually been pushing this issue and really blaming the Republicans for the repeal of Roe v. Wade or the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And, that may have an actual effect, on the election.
It just might, and then maybe for the last part of our conversation, Frank, if you will, another sort of issue / field that naturally we as coming to this from a German, European, international perspective will be interested in relation to the elections, and that's foreign policy. So traditionally, and correct me if you see this differently, foreign policy was not exactly the kind of issue that would decide an election or would win you an election in the United States. You might lose it because of foreign policy. Do you think that things are differently this time, for the fact that we have two wars in Europe, on the doorsteps of Europe going on, another one on the horizon, possibly China, Taiwan? Do you feel that foreign policy is going to be more important? And what does this mean with regard to Biden and Trump?
I don't think it's going to be more important this time than in the past, but in a narrow sense, it will be. We've already mentioned this, that an important part of the left wing of the Democratic Party has been very opposed to Biden's support for Israel. And young people are much more pro-Palestinian today than they were, a generation ago. And so that specific issue may hurt Biden. If you can get a ceasefire by the summer and things calm down a little bit, so you don't see these nightly pictures of Palestinian children, being bombed out of their homes, then that might, reduce the salience of that. Ukraine, I think some Republicans thought that there was a lot of popular opposition to supporting Ukraine, and that's turned out not to be true, that actually 2/3 of the House and 3/4 of the Senate voted in favor of this Ukraine aid act that was passed a few weeks ago. So I think there still is support for Ukraine, but that's not going to motivate people to go to the polls. There's hardly anybody that is going to vote for Biden because of his position on Ukraine. China, even, I mean, it's not certain exactly what the debate is because both parties have turned very anti-Chinese. I don't think it's necessarily going to be a critical issue for most voters, except in the sense that there is a general perception that Trump is a tough guy and Biden is weak, and that if there's a future crisis, Trump will be tougher. I think that's complete nonsense. I think that Trump really does not want to use American power anywhere. He doesn't want to stay out. He keeps calling Biden a warmonger. So I think if you actually want a tough foreign policy that supports allies around the world, you'd vote for Biden. But that is not necessarily the perception of many American voters.
I would agree, and all the John McCains and so on, even on the Republican side, are gone. So I don't really see any support for that sort of foreign policy for the time to come. Talking about foreign policy, though, in the context of the elections and Biden being somewhat torn, where things are going to go, because he has to try and arrange for the left wing of the Democrat Party and also the more conservative wing of the Democratic Party, and Biden seems somewhat torn in between. What do you make of that? Is foreign policy just an example where we can see just how torn the Democratic Party is and how hard Biden has to work for majorities, or what do you make of that task that he's facing?
I think, unfortunately, that Biden is being too much influenced by what he perceives as a relationship between his domestic election chances and foreign policy. Now, it's probably true that that connection exists with regard to the Gaza war. And so if they can get a ceasefire there sooner rather than later, that's going to help him. On Ukraine, they've made these really bizarre statements, like they wanted to prevent Ukraine from attacking oil refineries inside Russia because they thought that this would drive up gasoline prices in the United States. First of all, it's a ridiculous assertion. That's not going to have any effect on gas prices. But in any event, that shows a really warped sense of priorities where Ukraine is fighting for its national existence, and you're going to tell them to just hold off on your fight to save yourself, until our election is over. That just seems like a very misplaced set of priorities. And I think in general, it's kind of tragic, but the Ukrainians would not be in the dire situation they are now. Of course, the Republicans are primarily responsible for the cutoff of aid, but Biden from the beginning could have been giving them, better, longer range, more, lethal kinds of weapons to use against Russia. And I think they've been excessively intimidated by, the threat of escalation on the part of the Russians.
So there's intimidation, and maybe just for the last couple of minutes, really, Frank, before we wrap this up, in terms of, you mentioned intimidation. I was going to ask about credibility of the United States, globally. I do recall a time, and I think we met back then also, when the neocon idea of the U.S. role in the world was still pretty prominent, and the idea that little like cookie cutter Americas everywhere is a good idea. The world looks more like America, makes it a safer place. That idea seems to be out the window. But I would be interested in what you make of this. What about credibility of the United States globally? As you look back on Biden's term, has it increased? Has it declined?
Well, look, the biggest threat to American credibility is not anything that Biden can do. It's the underlying polarization. That's what's caused the cutoff of aid to Ukraine. And I think it's that polarization that is the single biggest source of weakness in America's ability to lead and restore order in the world, because nobody can count on the United States when it's that internally divided. You're at the point, Trump said this explicitly, that he didn't regard any external enemy like Russia or China nearly as big a threat as Democrats. I mean, it's an unbelievable assertion, that your rivals domestically are more dangerous than any foreign power. So as long as that polarization exists, I think, unfortunately, every country that depends on America is going to be very, very worried about, the credibility of those commitments. NATO, is obviously in big trouble right now because nobody can know whether the United States is actually going to even be a member of NATO in, 2-3 years. And so it's very important, I think, for world order, for the United States to get its house in order, to firmly reject the kind of isolationism represented by Donald Trump, and to, return somehow to a consensus that the United States really needs to play a major role supporting global security structure, supporting global trade, a world of global trade. These are very, very basic things if the world is going to be more stable in the future.
So just to try and end on a somewhat optimistic note, Frank, if I may ask you, you as an American who also knows the outside world really well, what is it currently, you think, in 2024 that Germany, Central Europe, or something can look to the United States and say, this is something that's inspiring. This is something how America deals with some very real challenges, and maybe that that old idea of American resilience coming to the fore and sort of making it out of that hole once again. Is there something that comes to mind where you feel, this is something that sort of gives me hope, as Francis Fukuyama, this is the way up?
Well, I do think that there's a chance that Joe Biden will not just win the election, but he and the Democrats will actually win by a big margin. I think that abortion issue has been very important. I think in a lot of the by-elections that have happened in the last couple of years, it's interesting actually that a lot of the state and local candidates in the Democratic Party actually do a lot better than Biden himself does. And so if they do extremely well in the coming election, then maybe that would signal, the beginning of the end for this kind of MAGA Republican extreme right-wing, movement within the Republican Party. The other thing that's happening is really American economic and technological leadership is still very, very strong. Now the main focus is on AI, but it continues to be the case that the American economy, as you pointed out, is doing much better than any other leading economy, including China's. And, that's still something that's a major strength of the United States that people ought to, pay attention to.
Well, only last week, someone in Texas told me Texas is doing so well, including in the solar energy department, that Texas should break free from the United States. I'm not going to ask you about that option. Maybe next time we get to talk to you. Thanks very much, Francis Fukuyama. Thanks for taking the time, for offering us a lens to look through at the events that are going on the ground, and thanks for making the effort to be positive. At the end, we appreciate it very much. Thanks for this.
Okay, thank you very much, Tobias. Bye-bye.
And thank you to all of you online and at the d.a.i. in Tübingen for listening, for thinking along, for sending so many questions. I think this is liberal democracy at its best. And thank you, obviously, to the d.a.i. Tübingen once again and our great team. You're fantastic. Everybody, please mark your calendars. June 4th is when our next conversation takes place at the Democratic Crossroads. And the title of this event is going to be Die Ohnmacht der Medien, so the power and or powerlessness of the media, and obviously in the context of the US presidential elections. We'll be having Marie-Astrid Langer, the US correspondent of the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, and Julius Fintelmann of the European correspondent. Looking forward to this very much. Again, thanks, Francis Fukuyama. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.